In Ojibwe teaching, everything in nature carries spirit. The cedar, the water, the soil beneath our feet are all alive, and they're all listening. Now, cedar is one of those sacred medicines. It's burned in ceremony to cleanse, to protect, and to heal. For generations, Ojibwe women have gathered cedar to pray, to bathe, to restore balance, because the forest, they say, holds medicine for those who walk with respect. The same medicine, the same cedar, may have protected what little remained of Susan Poupart when she was found in a cedar swamp 6 months after she vanished. Investigators say that the soil helped preserve evidence, but to Susie's people, it may be something deeper. Maybe that forest was still doing what it was created to do, and that was to protect. 35 years later, her community still listens for answers in those woods, and they're not the only ones anymore. Welcome to That's My Opinion, where we break down the biggest stories, uncover hidden truths, and explore why they matter. I'm Bacon Bears, and today we're talking about the unsolved murder of Susie Poupart, a young Ojibwe woman whose story still echoes through the forests of Wisconsin. Susan's case is going to be the first case in a series of cases that I want to do highlighting cold cases. So if there's a cold case that you in particular would like to highlight, please leave it in the comments down below and I'll write it down so that we could highlight it once a month moving forward. If you care about stories like this, cases that deserve more attention, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video. These stories only stay alive if we keep talking about them. As always, this video is for conversational purposes only. All information is based on publicly available sources, and everyone mentioned is presumed innocent unless proven otherwise in a court of law. Viewers are encouraged to do their own research and form their own opinions because this one's mine, and let's get into it. Susie Poupart was a daughter, a sister, and a mother of two. She was also an artist, creative, curious, and always tried to make the world a little brighter. She studied at the American Indian University in New Mexico, but back home in Lac du Flambeau, Wisconsin, is where she dedicated her life to her people. Susie served on the Lakeland Board of Education, was the secretary of the Flambeau Tribal Council, and worked as the director of the Great Lakes Intertribal Council Youth Services Program. She was the homeschool coordinator at the Flambeau Grade School and a member of the Tribal Education Committee, always encouraging others to learn, to lead, and to take pride in who they were. Those who knew her remembered her as warm and funny, someone who made people feel comfortable. Her family said that she could find humor in even hard moments, and she carried a quiet strength that made her easy to trust. She was a devoted mother of two young children, Alexandria, just 3 years old at the time, and Jared, who was 9. Her life was full, busy, and deeply connected to her community. But on the night that she disappeared, that connection was shaken forever. Her son Jared later shared that his grandmother had begged Susie not to go out that night. She had a bad feeling that she couldn't explain, and it's a detail that still haunts their family decades later, because by morning, Susie would indeed be gone. Susie's case is one of thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women, stories that rarely make national headlines but carry generations of pain, silence, and resilience. And tonight, we're changing that in any way that we possibly can. On the night of May 20th of 1990, Susie Poupart joined friends at a house party in Lac du Flambeau, a small Ojibwe community surrounded by pine forests and lakes. The gathering was typical for early summer: music, drinks, laughter, but sometime after 4 a.m., everything changed. Several witnesses later told investigators that Susie left the house with two men: Robert Elm, who was 21 at the time, and Joseph Cobb, who was 22, both local residents. But that was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Now, witnesses have different stories of what happened regarding Susie when they saw her leave. Some claim that she was forced into the car with these men, which, if that was truly the case, why did no one help her or call the police at that time? And some claimed she willingly got in the car to catch a ride home. However, when questioned later, Elm and Cobb said that they had offered Susie a ride home, but claimed she became upset and asked to get out of the car near the old elementary school a few miles from the party. The problem with that is the geography of their story. You see, the school sat in the complete opposite direction of Susie's house. Investigators immediately noted the inconsistency, and in later statements, the men's timelines and explanations shifted again, which, if you're telling the truth, why does your story keep changing? Now, also, I could not find any reportings on what the actual argument was about, so we don't know if that was something that they actually told law enforcement, but those men should be able to recall what the argument was about, and I'm curious to know what their story is. Her family would go on to report her missing officially on May 22nd of 1990, 2 days after she failed to come home. As soon as she was reported missing, the Vilas County Sheriff Office started searching across Lac du Flambeau. Deputies, volunteer firefighters, and canine units combed through miles of wooded terrain. The community even joined in, worried but hopeful that she had just simply gotten lost, or maybe she just went to stay with a friend. But days turned into weeks, and still there was no trace of Susan. At the time, the department faced major limitations. There was no tribal police force on the reservation, and very little specialized forensic support available in northern Wisconsin. Detectives collected what evidence they could, but technology was primitive. For Susie's family, those months were agony. They drove the back roads daily, posted flyers, and called the sheriff's office again and again for updates that would never come. Every unanswered phone call deepened their fear that something terrible had in fact happened. 6 months after Susan disappeared, her story would take a devastating turn. It was Thanksgiving Day, November 22nd of 1990. When two deer hunters were making their way through a stretch of dense cedar forest in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, about 12 miles southeast of Lac du Flambeau. The area was remote, wetlands, brush, and heavy cedar stands that few people entered except during hunting season. As the men moved through the undergrowth, they noticed something unusual near a fallen tree, a purse and a red jacket half covered by leaves. Inside the purse was an identification card with Susie's name on it. Realizing the seriousness of what they had found, the hunters hung the items on a low branch to mark the location and hiked out to alert authorities. Now, something about the area where Susie was found. This wasn't just the kind of place that you would just happen to stumble onto. The hunters who discovered her were locals. These were men who knew the land inside and out. This site was deep inside the forest and almost impossible to reach without knowing exactly where you were going. So whoever brought Susie out there knew this area. They had to. When investigators arrived, they uncovered what was left of a shallow, concealed grave covered with brush, plastic, and clear strips of duct tape. Clear attempts to hide the body. The soil was damp and rich with cedar needles and peat. Beneath that covering, they found partial skeletal remains, and a jawbone later matched through dental records confirmed that after 6 months of searching, they had in fact found Susie Poupart. Detective Sergeant Cody Remick later explained that the cedar swamp soil may have preserved critical evidence, but some in the community saw that as more than science. To Susie's people, it felt as though the forest itself had been holding her, keeping her safe until she could be brought home. The natural tannins and the lack of oxygen in the ground slowed decomposition, but not enough to save everything. Reports stated that Susie's remains were so degraded that they could fit into a single evidence bag. There was 6 months of northern weather, bacterial decay, scavengers, wolves, coyotes, even bears, and they had taken almost everything. And because of that decomposition, the coroner couldn't determine an exact cause of death. But the evidence of restraint, concealment, and distant from any road left investigators certain that Susie's death was a homicide. And yet one detail still stands out to me. Whoever did this went to great lengths with plastic and duct tape, traveling deep into the forest to hide a body. But why would you leave her purse? You left her jacket and her identification just like right there to be with her. And to me, it makes no sense. If this was a deliberate cover-up, why leave the things that proved exactly who she was? And I don't know, maybe it was panic. Maybe it's because they were intoxicated, because whoever it was at this party until 4 a.m. They were disoriented, or possibly like they were spooked before they could finish what they started because somebody or something was out in the woods. Those two things just don't go together. When Susie Poupart's remains were found, investigators with the Vilas County Sheriff's Office believed they were closing in on her killers. But months would turn into years, and the case moved through one procedural step after another without a single charge being filed. In Wisconsin, there's a legal process called Doe Hearings, and it's basically a private courtroom investigation where a judge, not a jury, listens to witnesses to decide whether there's enough evidence that a crime was committed and who might be responsible. Now, no one is officially charged yet, but it's a way for prosecutors to dig deeper when a case has gone cold or there isn't enough proof to file charges. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, the sheriff's office and the district attorney convened 3 separate John Doe hearings in an effort to gather testimony and finally move the case forward. Those hearings focused on 3 men: Robert Elm, Joseph Cobb, and Francis Fritz Schumann. Elm's cousin. Now, Robert Elm and Joseph Cobb were seen at the party, and it was Robert's car that Susan was in, whether it was willingly or unwillingly. We will never know the facts of that. But where does Francis come in? Well, he is the cousin of Robert Elm, and it is reported that Francis Schumann is bragging to people in the community that he had something to do with Susan's murder. Classy. As a side note, during one of the interviews with one of the suspects, Sheriff Fath placed Susie's photo on the table, and allegedly the suspect that he was with asked twice if the sheriff would put it away because he didn't like her eyes staring at him. And Sheriff Fath said, "The picture stays here. You need to see her." Now, he's never publicly said which suspect it was. I wish he did. When called to testify, Robert Elm invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refused to answer any questions. Joseph Cobb never even appeared. Now, you would think that would automatically mean arrest, but a John Doe hearing isn't the same as a criminal trial. It's a private investigation, not an indictment, and the court can issue a warrant for non-appearance, but it's up to the judge and prosecutor to push for it, and in this case, I guess they didn't. So Joseph Cobb just walked away. Francis Schumann did testify, but denied any involvement. Funny, you're not bragging now, are you? Allegedly. And he offered little to no information. Behind the scenes, law enforcement's frustration grew. Sheriff Joe Fath later told reporters, "We've tried to get them charged with crimes that they've committed since then because they really need to go to prison. We know that they've committed violent crimes against women in the past. They have not changed their stripes." And just imagine how hard that has to be for this entire community. Waiting decades for accountability while primary suspects just continue to live and work in the same area, even crossing paths with Susie's own relatives, including her kids. In a small town like Lac du Flambeau, silence can be powerful, but it can also be extremely dangerous. People whispered about what happened that night, but few were ever willing to speak publicly, whether out of fear, loyalty, or just the weight of living in such a close-knit community. Many potential witnesses stayed quiet. Now, some came forward at one point, but then they later recanted their statements. And I cannot imagine how devastating that must be for Susie's family, knowing that there are people in the community who know what happened, people who saw what they saw and yet remain silent. Somewhere out there, someone could bring truth to light, but they just won't. Before we had the kind of technology that exists today, investigators were working with little to nothing. When they recovered Susie's remains, one of the only trace materials they found was a single strand of deer hair stuck to the plastic sheeting near her body. No blood, no fingerprints, nothing that could give them a lead. And to make matters worse, when some of that early evidence was sent off for testing, the deer hair that was found on Susie and another deer hair that was found in Robert Elm's car, and they were trying to match it, the lab that it was sent to was completely destroyed by a hurricane, wiping out everything that they had sent. So for years, the case sat frozen in time, every possibility tied to a piece of evidence that either didn't exist anymore or couldn't be tested with the technology that they had. It would take decades and an entirely new generation of forensic science before investigators could finally try again. Back in 2014, investigators sent what little biological material that they had for testing, but the samples were too small and too degraded to create a usable profile. However, between 2022 and 2025, the Vilas County Sheriff's Office partnered with the Bureau of Indian Affairs Missing and Murdered Unit, or MMU, as part of a nationwide initiative called Operation Spirit Return. This collaboration brought in outside experts in a state-of-the-art private lab, Othram Inc., in Houston, a company specializing in advanced forensic genealogy for cold cases involving Indigenous victims. Now, if the name Othram sounds familiar for some of you listening, as it should, you might remember when I interviewed Indiana coroner Jeff Jellison, who's been working tirelessly to identify the victims connected to the Fox Hollow Farm case. He's also partnered with Othram for his investigations, which is the same lab now working on Susie Poupart's case. And hearing that name again genuinely made me happy because it tells me that some of the best people in forensic genealogy are involved. I would love love to sit down with someone from Othram one day and just talk about like what really goes into these this kind of work and how genealogy and science come together to finally give names back to the lost. I think that conversation would be not only fascinating, but incredibly important for understanding the power of this new technology. Honestly, it makes me so incredibly hopeful when it comes to cold cases like this, getting families the closure that they deserve. What we do know now is that Othram uses a process called forensic grade genome sequencing, FGGS, a powerful new method capable of pulling DNA from material once thought unusable. It can read genetic code from degraded, decades-old fragments like hair, bone, or even touch DNA left behind on plastic tape. In 2022, Othram received a $1 million contract from the BIA MMU to support cases like Susie's. And in January of 2023, their work would lead to a major success: the identification of Michelle Elbow Shields, the woman from the Pine Ridge Reservation who had been missing less than a year. That success proved the technology could do what older methods couldn't, and it gave investigators in Wisconsin real reason to believe Susie's case might finally break open. By 2024, Sheriff Joe Fath and Detective Cody Remick had resubmitted key evidence from Susie's file: the duct tape, plastic sheeting, and any remaining biological traces to be analyzed using these new techniques. As of 2025, the samples are still being processed. The renewed testing has sparked an outpouring of community support. A GoFundMe campaign was launched to help cover additional lab expenses and expedite DNA work, support DNA testing for Susan Poupart's case. Every donation, every share is one more reminder that people haven't forgotten Susie and that justice might still be possible. For Susie's children, Alexandria and Jared, this new chapter feels different. After 35 years of silence, there's finally something tangible. Whether this technology confirms long-held suspicions or uncovers something entirely new, they just want the truth, which is exactly what they deserve. Susie's story doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a much larger, heartbreaking pattern that stretches across the United States and Canada. A crisis that has become known as MMIW, the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. The Center for Disease Control lists homicide as the third leading cause of death for Native American women, a rate up to 10 times higher than for white women in some regions. And the National Institute of Justice found that 84% of Indigenous women will experience violence in their lifetime, with 56% experiencing sexual violence. And most of that violence is committed by non-Native offenders. Yet, you'll be happy to know that a 1978 Supreme Court ruling, Oliphant versus Suquamish Indian tribe, stripped tribal courts of the power to prosecute non-Native suspects who commit crimes on tribal land. Oliphant versus Suquamish Indian tribe was a case where a non-Native man assaulted a tribal police officer on the Suquamish Reservation in Washington. The tribe arrested him, but he argued that they had no right to prosecute him because he wasn't Native. And the Supreme Court would agree. It's shit like this that just makes me completely sick to my stomach. The court ruled that tribal nations had no authority to charge or prosecute non-Native people who commit crimes on tribal land unless Congress specifically gives them that power. That decision took away one of the most basic tools of justice from tribal governments: the ability to hold outsiders accountable when they hurt members of their community. And it's one of the main reasons so many cases involving Indigenous victims go unsolved today. Even if police on the reservation know who did it, they can't charge them. They have to rely on state or federal agencies. And many of those agencies don't have the resources or just don't simply care. And it creates this just nasty loophole where violent crimes, especially against Indigenous women, often go unpunished. The system is set up to fail them from the beginning. And then there's the silence of the media. A landmark 2018 study by Urban Indian Health Institute found that 95% of MMIW cases received zero national news coverage. So when Indigenous women go missing, their stories are almost never broadcast beyond their communities. Compare that to missing person cases involving white women, which receive 6 times more coverage on average. That disparity has been named missing white woman syndrome. And it isn't just about headlines, it directly impacts how fast tips come in, how long cases stay active, and how much pressure is put on law enforcement to find answers. In the last few years, there have been signs of progress. Savannah's Act 2020 now requires the Department of Justice to train law enforcement and standardize data collection for Indigenous cases. The Not Invisible Act of 2019 created a commission to coordinate efforts between tribal, federal, and state agencies. Operation Lady Justice, launched the same year, built an interagency task force dedicated to solving cold cases. And in 2021, the Bureau of Indian Affairs established its Missing and Murdered Unit, or MMU, the same division now assisting in Susie Poupart's investigation under Operation Spirit Return. These programs cannot erase decades of neglect, but they do mark a turning point. For the first time, tribal, state, and federal authorities are sharing resources, sharing data, and most importantly, sharing responsibility. As of 2025, Susie Poupart's case is still open and active, and for the first time in decades, there's genuine hope that science might finally do what human memory could not. Sheriff Joe Fath and Detective Cody Remick continue to lead the investigation locally, working hand in hand with federal and tribal partners, and after 35 years, they remain committed to finding answers. Quote, "We have to keep her story in front of people. Somebody out there knows what happened." If you know anything about what happened to Susie Poupart, even the smallest detail, it can make a difference. Investigators are still taking tips, and there's a $25,000 reward for information that leads to an arrest and conviction. If you have information, you can contact the Vilas County Sheriff's Office, and I will link all of the resources that I have in the comments. I won't even put them in the description. I'll pin them all in the comments. But even if you don't live anywhere near Wisconsin, there are still ways to help. Share Susie's story. The more people who know her name, the harder it is for this case to be forgotten. You can also support organizations working to end this crisis for all Native families. Groups like the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, MMIW, USA, and the Urban Indian Health Institute. They're the ones pushing for new laws, better reporting, and accountability for cases that have gone cold. And if you want to help Susie's case directly, there's a GoFundMe to support additional DNA testing through the lab Othram. I'll link all of it in the comments. But thank you for watching and taking the time to learn about Susie Poupart. Her story deserves to be heard and remembered, because silence only protects the people who did this. Share this video, talk about it, say her name, because awareness is how we break the cycle that's allowed these cases to be forgotten. Don't forget to like and subscribe. My name is Bacon Bears, and that's my opinion.